Welcome back to Autistic Coder. Today we're covering several new concepts that will help us retrieve and display Pokemon data from the PokeAPI. We'll go over arrow functions, promises, fetch, async await, and a few important React hooks. Let's dive in. Arrow functions offer a shorter way to write functions and are frequently used with JavaScript arrays to reduce the amount of code we need. For example, instead of using a for loop to find the number 2, we can use an arrow function with findIndex to achieve the same result in just one line. Mapping is a way to process each item in an array, often using an arrow function to keep it short and readable. For example, here we're using map to get the names of Pokemon as an array of strings. In our project, we use mapping to handle Pokemon data, transforming each Pokemon's details as we fetch them. In JavaScript, a promise is a tool for handling data that isn't available right away. You can think of it as a placeholder that represents data that will arrive in the future. Promises are perfect for handling tasks that take time to complete, like fetching data from a web API. Promise.all allows us to work with multiple promises at once. It waits for each one without having to wait for one to finish before starting the next. This way, all promises run simultaneously, and when all are done, promise.all returns an array of their results. It's ideal for situations where we need data from multiple async calls. For example, we use promise.all here to fetch data from several Pokemon URLs at the same time. If any promise fails, promise.all rejects immediately, allowing us to handle errors efficiently. There are two ways to get result from a promise. One is to call the then function of the promise, passing it as a function that takes the result of the promise, such as a response from a server, as a parameter. The other way is to use what I call async await syntax. Essentially, you await the promise in an asynchronous function. The function will wait for the promise to succeed, then the function will get the value the promise comes back with. The fetch function allows us to make requests to a web server or API. When we call fetch, it returns a promise. React hooks are special functions that let us add features to our components, like managing state and handling side effects. With hooks, we can add interactive behavior to function components without needing complex code. The most common hooks are useState for managing data that changes and useEffect for handling side effects like data fetching. In React, state represents data that can change over time. Each time we update the state, React re-renders the component to show the latest data. This makes state essential for building interactive apps where data can change based on user actions or updates, like a Pokemon app, where we display new Pokemon as they load. UseState is a React hook that lets us add state to a component. It provides a state variable and a function to update that variable. In our project, we use UseState to store Pokemon data in a variable called Pokemon data, and use setPokemon data to update it when new data is fetched. UseEffect is another essential React hook, letting us run code after a component renders. By adding an empty dependency array, we can make UseEffect run only once, right when the app loads. In our project, UseEffect is perfect for calling our Pokemon data fetching function once, ensuring the data loads when our app starts.
So now it's time to implement all this knowledge that you just gained into our application to pull data from the PokeAPI. So first things first, you're going to want to add the use client directive to the very top of the file. This is the Next.js directive that tells Next.js that all this code in this file is going to be run on the client. And then we're going to import the useState and useEffect functions from React. So here's table. And so we're going to implement the fetch Pokemon data and fetch space HP functions. Basically, the fetch Pokemon data function fetches a list of 10 Pokemon from the PokeAPI. And then for each Pokemon, we get a name and a URL. We're going to go through each Pokemon. We're going to pass the URLs to fetch based HP and get each Pokemon's base HP. And then we're going to return from fetch Pokemon data, we're going to return an object. that has the Pokemon's name and base HP. So down here in the home component, we actually use that function. We have a use state variable to store the Pokemon data, and then an asynchronous function that calls fetch Pokemon data and then sets the Pokemon data to the returned data. And then we use our use effect hook to call the display Pokemon data function. And then down here, we have essentially if the Pokemon data, if it's loaded, we display it in a Pokemon table. Else, we're going to display a loading thing. Once you've made all these changes to your application, go ahead and go to your command prompt or a terminal and go into the directory and run into the project directory and run npm run dev. Hit enter. And once it says it's ready, now we're going to go and we're going to copy and paste this into here. And you should see Pokemon app. You should have a name and base HP for 10 Pokemon.
Now that our app is set up to fetch and display data, it's time to add some style. In the next lesson, we'll dive into CSS to enhance the appearance of our Pokemon data table and give our app a polished look. Thanks for following along, and see you next time.